The moment I saw a stranger carrying my late husband's toolbox out of his workshop, I knew someone in my family had betrayed me. I was standing at my kitchen window with a cup of coffee gone cold in my hands when I saw the pickup truck parked beside Daniel's workshop. The old white building sat behind our house in northern Ohio, just beyond the maple trees he planted 20 years ago. My husband had spent almost every evening out there before cancer took him 2 winters ago. Even after his funeral, I still couldn't bring myself to step inside for more than a few minutes at a time. The smell of cedar wood, machine oil, and his aftershave still lingered in the air like he had only stepped away for lunch. That workshop was the last place in this world that still felt like Daniel belonged to me. So when I saw a tall man in a baseball cap walking out with one of Daniel's old red metal toolboxes under his arm, my stomach tightened so hard I had to grab the edge of the sink. At first I thought maybe Ethan had finally decided to clean the place out. My son had been talking about moving on ever since Ashley started complaining that the workshop was wasting space on the property. But then I saw something that made my heart sink even lower. The stranger wasn't with Ethan. He was laughing with Ashley. My daughter-in-law stood there smiling in her expensive cream-colored sweater, dangling a set of keys from her finger while she pointed toward the workshop like some kind of real estate agent showing off a rental property. I opened the back door so quickly the screen slammed against the frame. "Ashley," I called out, my voice sharper than I intended. She turned slowly, not startled at all. "Oh, Margaret," she said casually. "You're home early." Home early. As if I were a visitor on my own property. The man gave me an awkward nod before climbing into his truck. I watched him place Daniel's toolbox beside 2 folded ladders and a power saw I recognized immediately. My husband's tools. Ashley crossed her arms and sighed like I was inconveniencing her. "I was going to tell you eventually," she said. "Tell me what?" I asked. She glanced toward the workshop and smiled again. Calm and cold. I rented it out. It was just sitting there doing nothing. The wind moved through the trees behind her, and for a second I could almost hear Daniel's voice in the distance warning me not to let anyone touch that building. At that moment, standing barefoot on my own back porch, I realized something far worse than grief had entered my family after my husband died. Ashley walked past me and back into the house like nothing important had happened, but I stayed frozen on the porch staring at Daniel's workshop. The late afternoon sun hit the dusty windows just right, and for a moment I could still picture him standing inside wearing that old brown flannel jacket with sawdust on the sleeves. Every Saturday morning for almost 30 years, he would disappear into that workshop with a cup of black coffee and old country music playing softly through the radio near his workbench. He built birdhouses for neighbors, repaired church pews for St. Matthew's, and once spent 6 straight weekends building a cedar crib for Ethan before he was born. That building was not wasted space. It was my husband's life. When I finally walked inside the kitchen, Ashley was standing at the marble counter typing on her phone while a candle burned beside her designer handbag. She did not even look guilty. "How long has this been going on?" I asked quietly. She shrugged without lifting her eyes from the screen. "About 3 months. 3 months. My chest tightened again. "You rented out Daniel's workshop for 3 months without telling me?" She finally looked up then, but there was no softness in her expression, only impatience. "Margaret, nobody uses it anymore. We thought it would help with expenses." That word hurt worse than I expected. "Does Ethan know?" I asked. Ashley let out a short laugh. "Of course he knows." I nodded slowly, trying to keep my composure, but inside something was beginning to crack. My own son had known strangers were walking through his father's workshop, while I sat 10 yards away in this house believing the place had been left untouched. Ashley opened the refrigerator and took out a bottle of sparkling water, like we were discussing grocery coupons instead of betrayal. "Honestly, you are too emotionally attached to that building," she said. "It is unhealthy." I stared at her. "Your father-in-law built that workshop with his own hands. And now he is gone," she replied flatly. The words landed colder than January snow. She twisted the cap off the bottle and leaned against the counter. "You cannot preserve every old room forever just because someone died." I turned away before she could see the tears forming in my eyes. On the wall beside the hallway hung the last family photo we ever took before Daniel got sick. Ethan had his arm around Ashley, smiling proudly while Daniel stood beside me with one hand resting gently on my shoulder. Back then I truly believed we were a close family. But grief changes people. Sometimes it reveals who they really were all along. That night I could not sleep. Around midnight I looked out my bedroom window toward the workshop and noticed a dim light glowing beneath the door. Someone was inside. I stayed awake for nearly an hour staring at that thin strip of light beneath the workshop door. At first I told myself it was probably the tenant Ashley rented the place to, maybe working late on some home project. But something about it unsettled me. Daniel never liked people touching his tools, and he certainly never would have allowed strangers wandering around his workshop after midnight. I slipped on my cardigan and quietly walked downstairs so the floorboards inside the house would not creak loud enough to wake Ethan and Ashley. The night air felt colder than usual as I stepped onto the back porch. Crickets chirped out near the tree line, and somewhere in the distance a freight train groaned across the tracks outside town. As I got closer to the workshop, I heard the low sound of a radio playing old rock music inside. Then came a strange hollow thump. Not metal. Not wood being cut. More like someone knocking against the floor itself. I stopped beside the window and carefully peeked through the dusty glass. The man from earlier stood near Daniel's old workbench with a flashlight in one hand. Pieces of plywood had been moved aside near the back wall, and he was staring down at the floor with a confused look on his face. Then he tapped one of the boards again with the heel of his boot. Hollow. Even from outside I could hear the difference. My breath caught in my throat. Daniel had built that floor himself almost 25 years ago. I still remembered the summer he worked on it. Every night after dinner he disappeared into the workshop until nearly midnight, hammering and measuring with that stubborn concentration he had about everything he loved. One evening I carried him a plate of leftover peach pie and asked why he was replacing perfectly good flooring. He smiled without looking up and said, "Some things need stronger protection than people realize." At the time I thought he meant his tools. Now I was not so sure. Before I could think any further, the workshop door suddenly opened. The tenant stepped outside holding a cordless drill in one hand. He nearly jumped when he saw me standing there. "Sorry, ma'am," he said quickly. "Did not mean to scare you." I forced a polite smile. "Working late?" He nodded awkwardly and glanced back over his shoulder toward the floor. "Yeah. Weird thing though. Part of that flooring sounds empty underneath." My heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my ears. "Empty?" He scratched his beard. "Like there is space under it or something." Just then the back door of the house opened and Ashley stepped onto the porch wearing silk pajamas and an annoyed expression. "Margaret," she called out sharply, "you really need to stop hovering around the renters. You are making this uncomfortable for everybody." I looked at her standing there beneath the porch light, and for the first time since Daniel died, I began to wonder what else inside this family had been hidden from me. The next morning the house felt painfully quiet. Ethan had already left for work before sunrise, and Ashley sat at the dining table scrolling through her laptop while drinking one of those expensive iced coffees she ordered every morning. She acted as though nothing unusual had happened the night before. I stood at the kitchen sink washing a plate that was already clean, replaying the sound of that hollow floor in my mind over and over again. Finally I turned around and asked the question I could no longer keep to myself. "Who exactly is renting the workshop?" Ashley barely glanced up. "A contractor named Scott Miller. He needed temporary storage and workspace while renovating properties outside Akron." "Did you sign paperwork?" I asked. Her fingers paused above the keyboard for half a second. "Of course I did." Something in her tone sounded defensive. "Can I see it?" That finally annoyed her. She closed the laptop with a sharp snap and leaned back in her chair. "Margaret, why are you interrogating me?" "Because that workshop belonged to my husband. And now it belongs to the family," she replied coldly. "Which means Ethan and I have every right to make practical decisions." Practical. Ashley loved that word. She used it every time she wanted to justify treating memories like clutter. I dried my hands slowly with a dish towel while studying her face. There was confidence there, but also irritation, almost as if she were nervous I might discover something she had not planned for. "Daniel never let anyone touch those floorboards," I said carefully. Ashley rolled her eyes. "It is a floor, Margaret, not the crown jewels." Before I could answer, her phone buzzed loudly on the table. She glanced at the screen and immediately grabbed it, standing up too quickly. I have to take this. She walked into the hallway, lowering her voice, but the house was quiet enough for me to catch fragments of the conversation. No, do not move anything yet. Because she is getting suspicious. I said wait. My stomach tightened. A minute later she returned wearing an artificial smile that did not reach her eyes. Scott accidentally damaged part of the floor last night, she explained casually. Nothing serious. I stared at her. Damaged it how? One of the boards cracked. She picked up her purse from the counter. Honestly, that whole place probably needs to be renovated anyway. Then she walked out the front door without another word. The moment her car disappeared down the street, I grabbed my cardigan and headed toward the workshop. The morning air smelled like wet grass after rain, and tiny drops of water still clung to the windows of the old building. As I stepped inside, the familiar scent of cedar and machine oil wrapped around me again. But something was different now. Several tools had been moved from their usual places, and near the back wall, one section of the floor had fresh scrape marks around the edges. I slowly knelt beside the boards, running my fingers across the wood until I noticed something that made my breath stop completely. One of the nails was newer than the others. I stayed kneeling on the workshop floor for several seconds, staring at that single bright nail surrounded by older rusted ones. Daniel was meticulous about details. He always used matching hardware, even for shelves nobody else would notice. Seeing one newer nail there felt wrong, almost like finding a strange fingerprint inside your own home. I carefully pressed my palm against the wood and felt a faint vibration beneath it, hollow and distant. My pulse quickened. Before I could think better of it, I reached for the flathead screwdriver resting on Daniel's workbench. The handle was worn smooth from decades in his hands. I could almost picture him standing beside me, patient and calm, explaining how to pry something loose without cracking the wood. Gentle pressure, Maggie, he used to say. Wood remembers when you rush it. I swallowed hard and slid the screwdriver beneath the edge of the board. The wood shifted slightly but did not lift completely. Someone had sealed it tightly again. I froze when I suddenly heard tires crunching on the gravel driveway outside. A car door slammed. Ethan. I quickly stood up and stepped away from the floor just as he entered the workshop. His face tightened the moment he saw me standing near the loosened board. Mom, he said carefully. What are you doing out here? I studied my son's expression. Ethan had Daniel's eyes, the same deep blue that once made people trust him instantly. But lately he avoided looking at me directly for more than a second or two. I could ask you the same thing, I replied. He shoved his hands into the pockets of his work jacket and glanced toward the floor before speaking. Ashley said you were upset. Upset? I let out a quiet laugh. Your wife rented out your father's workshop without asking me. Ethan sighed heavily like a tired parent dealing with a difficult child. Mom, we talked about this. No, I corrected him softly. You and Ashley talked about it. You just forgot to include me. For a moment neither of us spoke. The silence between us felt heavier than the old wooden beams above our heads. Then Ethan looked down at the floor again. You should stay out of here for a while, he muttered. That sentence chilled me more than anything Ashley had said. Why? I asked quietly. Because the place is a mess right now. Or because you know something is under these boards? His head snapped toward me so quickly that I knew immediately I had hit the truth. Ethan's face lost color for half a second before he recovered. There is nothing under the floor, he said too quickly. I stared at him, and suddenly I remembered something from the week before Daniel died. My husband had called Ethan into the workshop alone late one evening. The two of them talked for almost an hour behind closed doors. When Ethan came back into the house that night, his eyes were red like he had been crying. At the time I assumed they were saying goodbye. But standing there now, watching my son avoid my gaze while protecting that floor, I realized Daniel may have told him something he never told me. For the rest of that day, Ethan barely spoke to me. He stayed upstairs in his home office while Ashley moved around the house making loud phone calls about renovation costs and rental income, like she was already turning the property into some kind of business investment. Around 4 in the afternoon, a delivery truck pulled into the driveway carrying stacks of long white boxes. I watched from the living room window as 2 workers unloaded polished metal light fixtures and modern shelving units. Ashley stepped outside holding a clipboard and pointing toward the workshop with a smile that made my stomach turn. She was redesigning it. By evening, the sound of drills and hammers echoed through the backyard. I finally walked outside just as one of the workers carried an old wooden cabinet out of the workshop and set it near the trash bins. My heart nearly stopped when I recognized it immediately. Daniel built that cabinet himself during our first year in this house. The wood still had tiny burn marks from where Ethan accidentally dropped a soldering tool on it as a teenager. I rushed toward it before the workers could load it into the dumpster. "Please do not throw that away," I said breathlessly. The young worker looked uncomfortable. "Sorry, ma'am. We were told to clear out the old stuff." Old stuff. That was what my husband's life had become to them. Ashley stepped out of the workshop holding her phone and sighed dramatically the moment she saw me. "Margaret, you cannot keep every broken piece of furniture forever." "This is not broken," I replied quietly, running my hand across the scratched wood. "Daniel made this." Ashley folded her arms. "Exactly. And now it smells like mildew and takes up space." I stared at her in disbelief. "You are throwing away his things?" "I am updating the workshop so it can actually make money," she snapped. "Do you know how much people pay for custom studio rentals now?" Then she lowered her voice slightly. "Honestly, Ethan and I are trying to think about the future because somebody has to." The cruelty in that sentence hit harder because she delivered it so calmly. Not angry. Not emotional. Just practical. That evening, after the workers left, I quietly carried the old cabinet back into the garage beside the house. My knees ached by the time I finished, but I could not bear seeing it destroyed. As I wiped dust from the surface with an old towel, something small caught my eye near the bottom drawer. A folded yellow receipt had slipped behind the wood panel years ago. I carefully unfolded it and froze. It was dated just 3 weeks before Daniel died. The receipt showed purchases from a hardware store in Canton. Industrial hinges, reinforced steel brackets, and a heavy-duty waterproof lockbox. My pulse quickened immediately. Daniel had been building something in that workshop shortly before his death. Something hidden enough to require waterproof protection. I stared toward the dark silhouette of the workshop through the garage window, and for the first time, I became certain that whatever was beneath those floorboards was never meant for Ashley to find. The storm rolled in just after sunset 2 nights later. Heavy rain slammed against the windows while thunder shook the walls of the house hard enough to rattle the dishes inside the kitchen cabinets. Ethan was still at work dealing with some emergency at the manufacturing plant, and Ashley had gone into town for dinner with friends from her yoga studio. I sat alone in the living room pretending to read while my attention stayed fixed on the workshop outside. Every flash of lightning illuminated the old building for half a second before throwing it back into darkness again. Around 9 o'clock my phone suddenly rang. The screen showed an unfamiliar number. "Hello." I answered cautiously. "Ma'am, this is Scott from the workshop," the tenant said over the sound of rain and wind. "I think there is a problem out here." My chest tightened instantly. What kind of problem? Part of the floor collapsed. I was already reaching for my coat before he finished the sentence. By the time I stepped outside, rainwater soaked through my shoes within seconds. The workshop door stood open, and bright light spilled across the muddy yard. Inside, Scott stood near the back wall looking pale and unsettled. One entire section of flooring had caved inward, leaving a dark opening beneath the boards. Broken planks hung crooked at the edges like rotten teeth. My pulse thundered in my ears as I moved closer. Beneath the floor was a narrow hidden compartment lined with concrete blocks, and inside it sat a black metal lockbox wrapped carefully in thick waterproof plastic. For several seconds neither of us spoke. Rain hammered against the roof overhead while the old radio near Daniel's workbench crackled softly with static. Scott finally looked at me. "Ma'am, I swear I did not know this was down here." I could barely breathe. "Daniel built this. He hid this himself." I slowly climbed down into the shallow compartment, my knees trembling as I reached for the box. It was heavier than I expected, cold and solid beneath my fingers. Across the top was a silver combination lock. Then I noticed something attached beneath the handle with yellowed masking tape. My name, written in Daniel's handwriting. Margaret. My vision blurred instantly. Scott awkwardly stepped back to give me space while I carefully peeled away the tape. Underneath it was a folded note sealed inside a plastic sandwich bag. My hand shook as I opened it. The note was short, written in the uneven handwriting Daniel developed during chemotherapy. If you are reading this, it means somebody finally ignored my warning about these floorboards. Do not let Ashley see what is inside before you read everything first. A chill ran through my entire body despite the humid air inside the workshop. Daniel knew. Somehow, before he died, my husband already knew Ashley could not be trusted. At that exact moment, headlights swept across the workshop windows. Ashley's SUV pulled sharply into the driveway outside. Ashley stormed into the workshop with rain dripping from her hair, and the sharp smell of perfume filling the air behind her. The moment she saw the broken floorboards and the open compartment beneath them, her expression changed instantly. Not confusion, not surprise. Panic. Real panic. "What happened?" she demanded, looking from me to Scott and then down at the black lockbox in my hands. Scott awkwardly stepped backward. "The floor gave out during the storm," he explained. Ashley ignored him completely. Her eyes stayed locked on the box. "What is that?" she asked too quickly. I slowly climbed out of the compartment holding the heavy box against my chest. "Something my husband hid." The muscles in Ashley's jaw tightened. "Well, if it belongs to the property, Ethan should probably handle it." Her voice sounded calm on the surface, but I could hear tension underneath every word. I folded Daniel's note carefully into my sweater pocket. "Daniel addressed this to me." Ashley crossed her arms immediately. "Margaret, with all due respect, you are emotional right now. Maybe we should wait until Ethan gets home before opening anything." That sentence alone told me everything. She did not want me seeing what was inside before she could control the situation. Thunder rumbled overhead while rainwater dripped steadily through the broken section of roof near the back wall. Scott quietly grabbed his jacket. "I think I should head out," he muttered. I nodded gratefully. The moment he left, Ashley stepped closer to me. "What did the note say?" she asked. "Nothing important." Her eyes narrowed slightly because she knew I was lying. For several seconds we stood facing each other inside the workshop while rain pounded against the roof around us. Then Ashley forced a smile that looked painfully unnatural. "You know Daniel loved all of us," she said softly. "He would not want family fighting over old secrets." Old secrets. Not memories. Not keepsakes. Secrets. Every word out of her mouth made me more certain Daniel had hidden this box because of her. I carried it back toward the house without answering. Ashley followed close behind me the entire way like she was afraid I might disappear with it. Inside my bedroom, I locked the door for the first time in years. My hands trembled as I placed the box on the bed beside me. The combination lock still blocked the lid shut, but taped underneath the bottom of the box was another small envelope. Inside was a folded card in Daniel's handwriting. "The code is our anniversary." Tears blurred my vision instantly. 42 years together, and even now he was still guiding me. My fingers slowly turned the lock numbers 0, 7, August 17th. The day we got married in 1981. The lock clicked open softly. For a moment I could not breathe. Then I lifted the lid. Inside were neatly organized folders sealed in plastic, several bank envelopes, a leather journal, and a second handwritten letter resting carefully on top. Across the front, in Daniel's uneven handwriting, were the words, "Margaret, if Ashley is still living in this house when you find this, you need to read every page before trusting anyone." I sat on the edge of my bed listening to the storm outside while Daniel's letter trembled in my hands. The house had gone quiet downstairs, but every creak in the hallway made me fear Ashley might try to come into my room. I finally unfolded the pages carefully. The paper smelled faintly, like cedar and machine oil, the same scent that always clung to Daniel's flannel jackets. "Margaret," the letter began, "if you are reading this, then I was right to worry. I prayed I would have more time to handle this myself, but my health failed faster than I expected." My chest tightened painfully as I kept reading. Daniel explained that during the final year of his illness, he began noticing unusual withdrawals from their shared savings account. At first he assumed Ethan was helping Ashley with bills because they had struggled after buying their oversized new home outside Columbus. But then the amounts grew larger. $10,000. $15,000. Credit cards opened in Ethan's name. Loans taken against investment accounts. Daniel had built over 40 years working construction management. Daniel wrote that every time he questioned Ashley, she blamed confusion, banking errors, or stress. Then came the sentence that made my blood run cold. I eventually realized Ashley was quietly moving assets while convincing Ethan it was necessary for their future. Tears blurred my vision as I turned the page. Daniel had attached printed bank statements, screenshots of wire transfers, and copies of emails Ashley thought nobody had seen. Some messages discussed converting the workshop into a future rental property after Daniel's death. One sentence from Ashley stood out sharply in black ink. "Margaret will never understand the paperwork anyway." I covered my mouth with my hand. All this time while I was grieving my husband, she had already been planning around me like I was some obstacle waiting to disappear. Then I reached the final section of Daniel's letter. "Ethan is not innocent," he wrote. "But I believe he allowed himself to be manipulated because he was terrified of losing his marriage. I am leaving this evidence for you because I know Ashley will eventually push too far. When she does, do not let guilt stop you from protecting yourself." A soft knock suddenly startled me. I quickly closed the folder just as Ethan's voice came through the door. "Mom? Are you awake?" I wiped my eyes before unlocking it. Ethan stepped inside looking exhausted, rainwater still damp on the shoulders of his jacket. Then his eyes immediately landed on the open lockbox beside me. The color drained from his face. "You opened it," he whispered. I stared at my son for several seconds before answering. "Your father knew everything." Ethan closed his eyes briefly like a man waiting for a sentence he already expected. "Mom," he said quietly, "please let me explain before Ashley finds out what is in there." That was when I understood something even more painful than betrayal itself. Ethan had known about the box all along. Ethan sat heavily in the chair beside my bedroom window and buried his face in his hands. For a long moment neither of us spoke. Rain tapped softly against the glass while the old grandfather clock downstairs ticked through the silence. I looked at my son and suddenly saw how exhausted he truly was. The dark circles beneath his eyes, the tension in his shoulders, the way his wedding ring twisted nervously around his finger. "Your father showed me the box 6 months before he died," he admitted quietly. "He said if anything ever happened to him, I needed to protect you." Anger rose inside me so fast it almost made my hands shake. "Then why did you let Ashley rent out the workshop?" Ethan looked away immediately. "Because things got out of control." I stared at him in disbelief. "Your father trusted you." "I know." His voice cracked slightly. "You think I do not know that?" He stood and began pacing the room slowly. "After Dad got sick, the medical bills started piling up. Ashley kept saying we were drowning financially. She convinced me refinancing the accounts was temporary. Then she started talking about investments, business ideas, renovations. Every time I hesitated, she said I was weak. I folded my arms tightly across my chest. And stealing from family made you feel stronger?" Ethan closed his eyes painfully. "I never wanted to hurt you." That sentence hurt more than yelling would have. Because deep down I believed him. Ethan was not cruel the way Ashley was cruel. He was weak. Weak enough to let someone else destroy the people who loved him. He finally sat back down and looked directly at me for the first time in weeks. "Dad started investigating the accounts after he realized Ashley was hiding credit card debt from me. He found emails, transfer records, everything. He was furious." I glanced toward the open folders beside me. Why did he not confront her? Ethan swallowed hard. Because he was afraid she would take the kids and leave. My heart sank. Of course, Daniel adored his grandchildren. Even during chemotherapy, he still drove 40 minutes every Friday just to watch Tyler's Little League games. Ashley knew exactly how to control people. Then Ethan said something that chilled me completely. Dad changed the ownership of the workshop before he died. I looked up sharply. "What do you mean?" Ethan reached into the lockbox and pulled out one final sealed envelope hidden beneath the journal. Inside were legal documents stamped by Stark County records. My eyes scanned the pages slowly until I reached the line that made my breath catch. The workshop and surrounding acre of land had been transferred into a protected family trust solely under my name nearly a year before Daniel passed away. Ashley had no legal claim to it at all. Ethan rubbed his forehead tiredly. Dad said Ashley would eventually try to turn the property into income the second he was gone. That is why he hid everything. Suddenly footsteps moved quickly down the hallway outside my bedroom door. Then Ashley's voice rang through the house, sharp and impatient. "Ethan? Where are you?" Ethan's face went pale. He looked at me with quiet desperation. "Mom," he whispered. "She cannot know you found those papers yet." The next morning was Memorial Day, and Ashley insisted on hosting the annual family barbecue anyway. By noon, the backyard was full of folding chairs, coolers packed with soda and beer, and distant cousins balancing paper plates loaded with hamburgers and corn on the cob. Children ran across the grass waving little American flags while country music played softly through outdoor speakers. To anyone standing outside our house, we probably looked like the perfect American family. But inside me, something had changed forever. I wore Daniel's favorite pale blue cardigan and kept the sealed folder from the lockbox hidden inside my leather tote bag beside me. Ethan barely spoke all morning. Every few minutes he glanced nervously toward Ashley, who moved confidently through the party greeting relatives like she owned the property already. Around 3 in the afternoon, Ashley stood near the grill laughing with her sister about renovation plans for the workshop. "Once we modernize it," she said loudly, "it could easily become a luxury guest rental. People pay ridiculous money for rustic spaces now." Several relatives nodded politely while I sat quietly beneath the maple tree listening to her discuss my husband's workshop like it was a business opportunity, instead of the last piece of Daniel left in this world. Then Ashley smiled brightly and added, "Honestly, Margaret has been very emotional about the whole thing, but eventually everybody has to move on." That was the moment I stood up. The conversation around the patio slowly quieted as I walked toward the center of the yard holding Daniel's folder in both hands. Ashley's smile faded slightly. "Margaret?" she asked cautiously. I looked around at the family gathered beneath the warm afternoon sun. Daniel's brother Frank stood near the grill. My sister Linda sat beside the picnic table. Even Ethan's children stopped running when they saw the expression on my face. "Before anybody discusses renovations to my husband's workshop again," I said calmly, "there is something this family deserves to hear." Ashley immediately stepped closer. "This is not the time for drama." I ignored her completely and opened Daniel's handwritten letter. My voice trembled only slightly as I began reading aloud. The backyard became silent except for distant birdsong and the soft rustling of leaves overhead. I read Daniel's words about hidden bank transfers, manipulated accounts, and his fear that Ashley intended to take control of the property after his death. Gasps spread quietly through the family as I held up printed records from the lockbox. Ashley's face drained of color. "That is not true," she snapped sharply. Daniel was confused from medication near the end. But then I handed Frank one of the bank statements. Daniel's signature sat clearly across the bottom beside notarized legal documents transferring ownership of the workshop trust solely into my name. Ashley looked toward Ethan desperately. "Say something." My son stood frozen beside the picnic table, unable to meet anyone's eyes. Finally, he whispered the words that shattered the last of her control. Dad was telling the truth. A heavy silence settled across the yard. Ashley stared at Ethan in disbelief while relatives exchanged uncomfortable looks around her. For the first time since Daniel died, she no longer looked powerful. She looked exposed. By sunset, most of the relatives had quietly gone home. Paper plates still sat abandoned on picnic tables, and half-melted ice floated in coolers near the porch steps. The backyard that once sounded full of laughter now felt strangely hollow. Ashley locked herself inside the upstairs bedroom shortly after the barbecue ended. Ethan spent nearly an hour sitting alone at the kitchen table staring at his hands before finally leaving the house without saying where he was going. For the first time in 2 years, the silence inside the home did not feel lonely to me. It felt honest. I carried Daniel's folders back into the workshop just as the evening sky turned deep orange behind the trees. The broken section of floor had already been covered temporarily with plywood, but the smell of rain and damp cedar still lingered in the air. I moved slowly through the room, touching familiar objects as I passed them. Daniel's measuring tape still hung beside the workbench exactly where he left it. His reading glasses rested near an unfinished birdhouse covered in dust. A small coffee stain remained on the corner of his drafting table from the winter morning. He spilled his thermos while laughing at one of Ethan's old childhood stories. For weeks I had looked at this workshop as a place filled with grief. But standing there now, I finally understood what Daniel had really built. Not just walls and shelves and cabinets. Protection. Even while dying, he had been trying to protect me. I opened the old cabinet I rescued from the trash and carefully placed the lockbox inside. Then I organized every folder, every handwritten note, every legal paper exactly the way Daniel would have done himself. Calmly, carefully, deliberately. Through the workshop window I noticed headlights pull slowly into the driveway. Ethan stepped out of his truck alone and walked toward the building. He looked older somehow, like the truth had finally stripped away whatever illusion he had been hiding behind. He stopped just inside the doorway and looked around quietly. "Ashley is leaving for a while," he said softly. I nodded once but said nothing. He swallowed hard before continuing. "Mom, I know sorry is not enough." For a moment I saw the little boy who used to follow Daniel around this workshop carrying nails in oversized pockets. The same boy who cried for an hour when he accidentally scratched his father's truck at 16 years old. Somewhere along the way, fear and weakness had replaced honesty. But beneath it, he was still my son. "Your father loved you very much," I said quietly. Ethan's eyes filled with tears immediately. "I know." We stood there together in silence while evening shadows stretched across the wooden floor. Finally he asked, "What are you going to do with the workshop?" I looked around one last time before reaching for the old brass light switch beside the door. Warm yellow light filled the room exactly the way it had every night Daniel worked there. "I think," I said softly, "I am finally going to leave it exactly the way he wanted." Then I locked the workshop door myself and slipped the key into my pocket, knowing some things are not valuable because they make money. Some things are valuable because they remind you who truly loved you when it mattered most.